Hi, it's Dustin Lanier. Thanks for listening. Please find me on LinkedIn for original public sector operations content every week. And please reach out to me if I and my team of procurement professionals at Civic Initiatives can help you be a public procurement change agent. I'm Dustin Lanier, and Jana Thompson joined us recently.
Jana Thompson. I just joined Dustin at Civic Initiative a couple months ago. Prior to that, I was with the University of North Dakota as their Director of Procurement and Continuous Improvement for about 7 years. I also have some state purchasing experience for about 5 years, but in total over 28 years of purchasing experience.
We thought that it'd be interesting to talk about Jana's experience in some transformation projects that she kicked off while she was with UND. I know that you guys had started something around 2019. So before we get into what happened, why did you decide there was a need to change something, and what were you doing to try to drive some procurement transformation for UND?
University of North Dakota has enrollment of about 13,000 students. We are an R2 research institution, so a lot of purchasing activity, a lot of research activity going on. And we had done a lot of transformation since I had started there. We had combined some departments, particularly procurement and accounts payable, just to make it more cohesive between the two areas and make the whole experience from procure to pay more seamless for campus as well as behind the scenes. We did some of that work, but we really weren't exactly where we needed to be very efficient. So as we were examining what a lot of the other institutions were doing, we saw that e-procurement really was the way to go. So we did an acquisition of a system, and we signed the contract in 2019 and went down the road of implementation. The implementation portion and the onboarding of the integrations and such, the project went pretty well. We had a major supplier cleanup project that we had to do, which threw us a little bit off of our timeline, but we had to clean it all up because we shared our ERP system with 11 other institutions, so I had to get our information in there to accurately align with how we wanted to make some of our process efficiencies and transition from paperless to as much paper-free as possible. So we still had some issues. A lot of the things that were happening in the background were that we were very reactive to the way spend was happening. So we had P cards all over the place, and those charges weren't hitting until a couple months after they were happening out in the department. So people were making the charges, they were getting paid for on the card itself, and then the actual reallocation was happening, so they hit the budgets. And so people didn't know those charges were happening. They didn't know where they were actually going to hit on the account codes. And so then the finance people would come back and say, well, all of a sudden, we had 20 purchasing cards that had up to $10,000 worth of spend on them, came through, and they had no idea that that was hitting their account codes. So between that type of issue happening repetitively every month for all over campus, we also weren't buying off of contracts. We didn't have any consolidated spend on savings contracts or cooperative contracts. So people were just going out and buying pens wherever they wanted to do, or their office supplies, or their favorite merchants and stuff. So it was pretty maverick at that point in time, and we weren't achieving any savings. So we knew that we had to get to a better point in time, and this project really was an effort for us to take it to that next level.
So you started the project as you expected, and you were supposed to be live by...
We did a little bit of a different implementation approach. We chose to go live with our marketplace and our accounts payable, and we had some workflow built in, and we were live with our research materials manager program to half the campus. So we chose the areas on campus that were very, very supportive of us finding new solutions for them. They were eager to be in a new environment. They were tired of the old ways. They wanted to have these improvements in place. So we went live with half the campus on March 1st. We were sent home on the 20th of March for that which we're not supposed to call anymore. So, so everybody went home, and we actually thought it would only be for a few days or maybe a week or so, and found ourselves there for a very long period of time. The original plan was to go live with the second half of campus as of April 1st. And we had some discussions internally, and we said, do we keep doing this? Do we move forward this way? And we ended up going live because, as we found out, when people were at home, they didn't want any of our employees going on campus unless you were an essential worker. And there was so much PPE requirements, so much social distancing, that it was just better for us to have the electronic processes in place instead of having all the paper and old processing and checks and all the other ways of doing business in place while the pandemic was going on. So here I said the word. I'm going to end up saying it, unfortunately. So yes, we did go live as of April 1st, but there were a lot of tweaks that ended up having to happen while we were at home too.
So what adjustments did you have to make in order to keep this going even in the midst of that?
I think, as I mentioned before, we had some suppliers that we did a major cleanup of our suppliers. And before we actually went live with our e-procurement system, we were very much a check-based AP system. So he was an AP dedicated resource, but he was also functioning as an office manager / administrative assistant. And he sat right at the front of our office. And he was sitting there with a pile of checks like this, 3 times a week, processing paper checks. So when we went through and chose to set up our new suppliers, we actually asked them to give us an ACH payment form or an electronic payment form so that we could transfer from getting rid of all these paper-based and manual processes. And while we did have a pretty good response rate when we were doing the supplier cleanup prior to the pandemic, once the pandemic hit and no one wanted to go in the office, including our suppliers, to go pick up the paper checks, boy, we had people calling in and saying, here, we want you to pay this location, we wanted you to mail this check here, or even, hey, we don't want to take paper checks anymore. So some of those tweaks too are more on the AP side were happening. A lot of different payment methods from how our people on campus wanted to get paid I think there was more tweaks on that side. We've actually got our accounts payable manager sitting here and she's kind of, yep, we had some different things going on that side. And how we received invoices. So prior to the pandemic, we had invoices coming in all over campus. So our suppliers were sending, if they did business with the medical school, they would, they'd come in and say, oh, hey, there's Nancy from the medical school. I'm just going to drop it off because I can also make a sales call when I'm there and drop off a little bit of some swag with her too. And that's my interaction with her and I get sales when I do that. Well, that all stopped at that point in time. So that person, repeatedly had been doing that, now is calling in our office and said, I can't see Nancy, she's not there anymore, and I have this invoice, and I did drop one off, it's probably still sitting on her desk because she's not coming in, how can I get this information to you? So they were reaching out to us to say, we don't want to do that anymore, we want to go electronic, just like the rest of your suppliers are doing.
So while this isn't a Jagger commercial, you did deploy Jagger. So for the context of people who may be in the room have that, what were the modules that you guys rolled out?
Initially, we did the ePro, which is the marketplace. Our initial goal was to stand up 26 suppliers or catalogs right away. I think we went live with just short of that, maybe 24, I think it was. So we did go live with all of those. Accounts payable was another one. We had workflow set up for approvals and processing. And then the research materials management, the RMM module went live. Eventually, we did go on, while everybody was working remotely, we stood up the contracts module and the sourcing module as well.
So you started on time, we kind of interrupted, sent people home, you still finished getting that deployment up. So we talked a little bit about how the system helped you in this situation to be able to deal with some stuff. We talked about some of your CFO comments and the rest. So how did actually doing some transformation help you in that time period?
I guess the point of this whole thing was to say that there's always going to be a road bump, whether it's a major world event like what we had, or if it's simply someone in your office that's been an owner of a process for a very long period of time and hasn't shared that process with someone else. When they leave, that's a major hole in your operations. So bringing this on board during this transformation was a learning point for us because we found the holes that we weren't anticipating before we went into the whole Jagger implementation piece. So we found what the tweaks that we made when we were at home working remotely were those few things that no one had documented, the things that people were not expecting to see, and the things that we didn't even anticipate before we were going live. So it was helpful, but it's really what we should have done is taken a step backwards and saw where our strengths and our weaknesses were, and we really were going to fall short in all of this.
So how about actually dealing with, then when money started coming through the door in response, that has to be tracked and accounted for. I think you talked about the CFO saying that would have been impossible to have done without some tools.
Absolutely. We received a lot of CARES funding, and all that CARES funding, if it hadn't have been for the marketplace standing up and being able to track all that money through the marketplace and using those catalogs, our Associate Vice President of Finance said that it would have been almost impossible for her to track our CARES funding because of the way we were using purchasing cards and how they were hitting our general ledger after we were reallocating the expenses. So when those purchases were made in the ePro in the marketplace, they were getting coded to the appropriate codes right away. So she was able to pull that spend file and get it to the appropriate authorities for the CARES reporting. And so she had everything pulled immediately and headed in on time, which for all of our schools in our area, there's 11 institutions in the State Board of Higher Education for North Dakota. She was always the first one that was able to submit her information, and she said it was so much easier having those reports available. We told anybody that if they were using CARES funding, it had to be processed through the Jagger system, just so that Carla, who is our AVP, could get that information for the CARES reporting.
So talk about the people side of some of this. We've been talking about like some technical characteristics, right? And then I think you also mentioned there may be places where maybe some of the processes have some gaps, so there needs to be some mapping of that. You happen to be a Lean Six Sigma black belt. I don't know if you were in there doing the process mapping yourself or other folks, but how are you trying to bring the processes along and improve them because of the transformation? And then how do you make people feel the change, that it's not just a technology project?
I think there were some people who were fearing the change of the implementation, and also moving home. I think there was some fear moving home. We had a lot of people who had many years of tenure there. We're talking 25, 30 years of being in the exact same job or nearly the exact same job, doing the same thing over and over again. So they didn't really understand that, we weren't getting rid of them with new technology. Their role was just changing. They were going to add value in a different way. So we had conversations with them before we ever implemented the system, and even, in advance of starting to work on some of this, to let them know, hey, we need your knowledge and we need to pull this out because we need you to help develop what the next stage is going to look like. And so when they started to see that, yep, we're contributing to how this is going to be effective because we are the process owners, that made them feel important. But also the fact that when they went home, they realized that they didn't have to be sitting at a desk touching a bunch of papers and stamping. I mean, we had a gal, she was literally stamping. You could hear her with her stamper, and she'd do that multiple times a day. And with our new system, she wasn't stamped. It was in the system all again. And she went home. She was able to be with her grandchildren who were needing to be homeschooled, and her daughter had to be in the office because she was an essential worker. And so she was happy to be able to do something different, but still do her work that she knew very well and still be valued. She learned something about herself from this transformation. She learned something about how she could be important even in a new world, doing something different after over 30 years of working in the same area. And we also had another employee too who took on additional responsibilities. The gentleman who was processing the paper stacks of checks, he is actually one of the people who he can still look up and make sure that, he's auditing all the electronic payments now. So he is valued in a different way, and he finds joy in still being an important person. He was important because he held the checks, right? And now he's important because he can contribute in another way. I think on the flip side, we also realized there were a few people who do appreciate being in the office more than working at home. And I don't know that anybody really anticipated that. I think everybody was like, oh, we're going to be working at home. This is going to be the greatest thing since sliced bread. But when there are some people who just really want to be in touch and in contact with other people, and that comfort of being in an office environment, and there was some flexible arrangement for work that came out of the situation as well.
Yeah, I mean, I've led a lot of assessments of procurement programs, and one of the things I always try to talk to staff about is the number of procurement staff that we have is generally pretty finite. Mm-hmm. So the people that we have are super important. Every one of those people is super important, and every time they touch something, it should take the maximum value out of the strategic touch. If the function that person is doing can be automated through a system with the stamps and the rest, That doesn't mean that we're not going to try to develop that person. In fact, that person is very dear to us. In some of the longer speeches I do, I tell a story about an assessment where they had me go talk to Lindsay and see what her job was, and her job was just the smallest job you could ever imagine, like 3 phone call bids for replacement lawnmower parts and fruit juice concentrate, and she had a list on the wall, and I took it to the execs that had sponsored that assessment, and I said, you told me to talk to her because we want her to be interested in procurement, but this is her job. Mm-hmm. And people will opt out of that job. So technology and transformation opportunities, they can be scary to staff, mm-hmm. but if we communicate with staff that the most important thing is if they've chosen procurement as a profession, we will help them grow. Mm-hmm. And the job that they have today may not be the same job they have tomorrow, but that can be a great opportunity for change, for fulfillment. Any other concepts in there?
I think on the procurement side too, our procurement staff, they realized that they were able to do a lot of their job from at home, you know, and a lot of the procurement people in our area had young families and young children at home. So it was beneficial for them to be able to find that work-life balance and be there, because our kids had to come home for I don't know how many months, and they made additional efficiencies just because they wanted to continue to be at home. They saw things that they were doing that were probably not necessarily the most value add when they were in the office, and just said, you know what, I probably don't need to be doing it that way. Let's tweak this so it's more, I can do it from at home, and we can change this to be electronic. I know that we added more forms within the system so that people could submit things through forms instead of having to email requests and then that back and forth through email. A lot of email was reduced simply because of the additional forms that we put into the system. So some of those additional efficiencies came out of the fact that people found that new life, or they found that new way that they wanted to work.
So we called this transforming in turbulent times, and I don't think anyone thinks that our turbulent times are done. Our turbulent times are now different. We have supply chain issues that are prevalent, and staffing is a problem. You know, I talked to a deputy for a state recently, and they said they went back and did some analysis, and they used to have 45 applications per position, and now they're at 10. Mm-hmm. So we still need to make sure that our procurement shops are as effective as they can be, and that we're creating jobs that people want to have. So talk about how you look at today and some of the turbulent times today, and if you were advising somebody who was either starting one of these kind of projects or maybe in the sagging middle of these projects where they get hard because all of these projects are hard, what kind of advice would you give them on creating something that's going to succeed, or trying to make sure that you keep the energy in it to the end?
Lead times are changing with suppliers. There was recently a supplier that came around and changed the lead time from, like, I think it was 42 days to 140 some days. You know, things are taking long because of transportation. They're taking long because of materials and the price to get things here and there. There's, like I said earlier, there's always going to be a bump somewhere. And I think to anticipate that, not that be, you know, oh my gosh, something's going to happen, but to know and take an evaluation of your shop and the people who are working in there and say, if Dan tomorrow wins the lottery and he has been your PCAR administrator for the last 20 years and he has not documented any of your processes and he decides to not come in after the next week or so, what's going to happen to your shop? So, or if you have a lead person who has been responsible for all of your policies and they've been saving all those policies to their desktop and you have no access to the backups or the drafts or anything, what happens to you at that point in time? So I think if you take a good, you know, ask yourself those questions that, you know, you wouldn't normally do it on a day-to-day basis, but more of an evaluation of, if this scenario happens, how am I sitting? Am I prepared for this to happen? And have a backup plan and work towards that. Maybe have some additional documentation. Find out what your strengths are. Find out what maybe your weaknesses are. And develop a slow plan to get yourself to that next level so that if something happens, again, it doesn't have to be a worldwide event, just a small thing even. Maybe they decide to change a department on you. I don't always necessarily know when a major shift happens in HR or departmental changes when it happens at the university. But when those things happen, are you prepared to realign your organization? And if so, do you have that plan of what it would look like to get to the next step? And even taking a look at some of the technologies. I know that when we decided to do the acquisition of the software, I reached out to many, many different schools and many different people. And I just said, how are you doing things? What's best practice? What would you have for advice for me? And as I said, I've worked in private business for several years of my career as well. The best part about higher education is that everybody is willing to share. I tell you what, it's amazing, and it's an asset that you should take advantage if you have not already. And the people are amazing. They want to help you out, see what other people are doing, and these conferences are a great way to do so. We also did a little bit of, with some Lean Six Sigma background, but even just process mapping. Just take a look at your processes, map them out, and just say, when you're doing purchasing requests, how do they come into you? How do they, plot them out on a map and just take sticky notes and just say, what does this look like? And is this the best touch point? And you see a lot of different variations in some of your normal day-to-day activities. Might be a good opportunity for you to say, is this the most efficient way to do this? And if tomorrow we have to change again and everybody has to come back in the office instead of being a remote worker, should we keep doing this? So I would just say, do some analysis.
One of the best things about doing that early is you may identify things that are totally within your power to control and improve by making a choice.
Right.
If you want to do a good source to contract implementation, you should have a modular RFP template. If you don't have a modular RFP template, your software provider is not going to teach you how to do that. Mm-hmm. So that is totally a policy and process decision and system thinking about procurement. And all of that process stuff that you described, working that kind of perspective of somebody may leave their work, and sadly today, people leaving their work is not as dramatic as winning the lottery, right? I mean, there is a lot of change that's happening. The same things that you would do for succession planning and defense also make you an excellent customer for e-procurement. Mm-hmm. Because if you select a vendor and you hold them to a schedule to deliver a certain amount of product, they're going to want to come in and do certain types of discovery with you about how your stuff works today. You could have done all of that before and potentially use that in negotiations. So those activities are very solid. So thank you guys for being here, and we appreciate your inputs and insights.